This type of pruning shear, and of course you get the long handled loppers as well, this is called bypass, a pair of bypass pruners. And the reason that it is called that is because this cutting surface right here passes over this also fairly sharp surface. It bypasses it, and that tends to make a very clean cut. The other type of pruner is what we know as an anvil pruner. And it's the pruner that has a flat surface that the blade comes down on top of. As you can imagine, that tends to crush the tissue before it really cuts it. Bypass pruners are always preferable to anvil type pruners. And you'll need to sharpen them depending on how much pruning you've done or someone has done, and depending on how good the steel in the pruners is. When you buy a pair of pruners, the price to a large degree will be, come on in, and the price is usually going to be determined by how good the steel is. And if a pair of pruners costs $9.98, unless it was mismarked, it's probably not worth buying, because you simply aren't going to get good steel on pruners at a super low price. Now, to me, the $9.98 pruners are the ones for people that either loan their pruning shears out, and if you can loan out a lousy pair of shears, because people always bring them back. If you loan them a good pair of shears, you won't even see them again unless you go over and, exert all sorts of threats and things like that. As I was mentioning last week, for those of y'all that came to the Rose seminar, we have a book somewhere of gardening definitions, and I love their definition of a rotary lawnmower. It's defined to be a gasoline-powered metal detector, which is used to locate pruning shears left in tall grass. So if you tend to leave your pruning shears around, yeah, buy cheap shears. But buy good shears and keep them on the sharp side. Again, be careful who you let do pruning for you, because I love the story of caught the guy pruning, actually cutting the chain link fence with the pruning shears. A former employee, not a current employee. But he said, well, it just works so well. Good shears will cut almost anything, but it tends to leave big notches in the blade. So use your pruning shears to prune what they were intended to prune. Anyway, use good shears, use sharp shears, and use a good quality steel. Now, when should you prune, or at what age should you prune plants? Well, pruning is done for two reasons. One reason is to maintain plants at a given size or shape, and perhaps the more important reason, at least with young plants, is to encourage branching. Now, I told you, when you cut that stem and this hormone's moving up the stem, typically in a healthy, vigorous plant, it's going to make 3 or 6 or 8 little buds pop and begin to form new branches at that point. If you're interested in selling to a mass merchandiser, I won't grace them with the name of nurseries, but if you're interested in price alone, they typically let their shrubs grow up really big without pruning them, because that way they get a bigger shrub more quickly and they can sell it for a higher price. When you're dealing with a quality grower like we try to deal with, this Pittosporum is from greenleaf growers that we buy a lot from. And if you look down here, you will see that this plant was actually pruned when it was about 6 inches tall. And that's why it started putting all these lower branches on. And then it was pruned again while it was about 10 inches tall. And that's why all these branches up and down each individual stem have sprouted and grown. It took that grower literally twice as long to get a plant up to this size. And so they charge us twice as much money for it, so it's a more expensive plant. But next time you're at one of those other places, I'm sure it'll just be a research trip. You're not going to be buying anything there. But go in and look at the Pittosporum you'll see there. And they will be this tall, and they will have about 3 stems that are coming up like that. Where it's important to conserve money on buying plants and things, conserve money by buying smaller plants, not by buying lower quality plants. People always ask, should I buy a 1-gallon plant, a 5-gallon plant, or a 15-gallon plant? And I always tell them, whatever you can afford. Buy the biggest plant that you can afford to buy that you can dig the hole for. If you live where I live, there are a lot of places on my ranch that I couldn't dig a big enough hole to plant a 15-gallon plant even if I wanted to. But there's no real difference in the quality of a 1-gallon, a 5-gallon, a 15-gallon plant. When you buy a plant, the price you pay should be dependent on how long it took the grower to grow it. I always tell people, think of a greenhouse or think of a growing area as a hotel. The longer you stay in that hotel, the higher your charge is going to be when you decide to leave. The longer that grower has been maintaining and growing that plant, the more he's going to charge you for it. And that's why a 5-gallon pittosporum costs about the same as a 5-gallon viburnum, costs the same about as a 5-gallon Indian hawthorn, whatever else. So where you have a lot of planting to do or where cost is a real concern, just buy smaller plants. Don't necessarily look for cheaper plants, because in many cases the difference you get is a plant that was really properly pruned to begin with. So if you are planting smaller plants, if you are planting 1-gallon plants, and you say, oh, I want them to get them as big as I can, as quickly as I can, so therefore I don't want to prune them much. You don't have to prune them a lot, but I still suggest that you prune them some. Unpruned, this little growth right here on this pit probably is going to continue to grow pretty much upright. It might branch and put on, you know, 1 or 2 little side branches. But if this was a plant in my yard, I'd go through this time of year and I'd simply take that off. Now what happened? That means that when this is coming out instead of one. So young plants you prune to encourage branching. If you're looking for a 10-foot hedge and you've planted loquat or whatever, doesn't mean you shouldn't prune them the first year. It means that you probably should not prune them as heavily. But it still is important to go through and tip them back a little bit just to encourage branching while the plant is young. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so that's the first case, and that is young plants that we want to prune to encourage branching. Let's jump ahead to overgrown plants. Plants that are strictly in your neighbor's yard, but things that have gotten way too big because nobody got around to pruning them when they should have. Leaves on a plant perform 2 different functions. Obviously, the most obvious one, they're green, they have chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the only substance on earth that can take the sun's energy, convert it into chemical energy, which then is stored in the form of carbon bonds within the plant. So the most common and well-known thing that leaves do is to absorb the sun's energy and store it. The second thing that leaves do on a plant is release water vapor. There are little openings in the back of the leaves that perform several functions. They're called stomata. And each individual stomate opens up, and when it does, it allows carbon dioxide to come in, but in the process, it also lets water vapor go out. Most of the water that is taken up by the roots of your plants is then lost out through the backside of the leaves, through the stomata. An evergreen plant that is used to taking up lots of water and losing that water out through the leaf, if you take all the leaves off the plant, what happens? Well, it's probably going to drown because it has no way to continue absorbing the water and getting rid of it. So when we prune an evergreen plant, it's very important that we try to never take more than 30% of the foliage off at one time. Occasionally we may go up to 50%. But in a dry year you might get away with cutting it more than that. But in a wet year, if you take too much of the foliage off a plant at one time, it will fold up and die from having stayed too wet, because it no longer has the leaves to get rid of the moisture. So what do? We've got, well, I've got a pittosporum outside my back door that's about 15 feet tall and about 15 feet wide. If I were foolish enough to want to cut that plant back to a 5-foot plant, how would I do it? Because if I cut it off at 5 feet, I've taken off 99% of the leaves on that plant, which probably would be the death of the plant. I don't want to do that. I intentionally let it get big. But if you had, or if your neighbor had badly overgrown plants like this that really needed to be reduced in size, the way that you would do it is look at that plant, and let's say it has 10 major trunks coming up, all of them with lots of leaves on the top. We'd go through and take 3 or 4 of those trunks and we would cut them down pretty low. So then what's going to happen? The ones that we've cut down, they're going to start putting on all new green leaves and lots of little branches coming out where you cut them back. Once they've got some new leaves starting to come out, well then we can go through and cut some more of those tall stems back. And they will start putting on leaves. Then we go back through, sometimes the second time, sometimes the third time, and cut the last of those tall limbs back. So it's a 2 or 3 step process. It doesn't mean cut it here, and then cut it here. It means cut out about 1/3 up to half of the lower limbs down here, let them begin to branch out, and then cut the rest of them back. That's how you reduce the size of an overgrown plant. Now, if you have something that's badly overgrown, that may or may not be the best solution. If you've got to reduce the size, that's how you do it. In the case of this Pittosporum, which was already hugely overgrown when I moved into the house, I decided I'd make it more tree-like. So I took all the lower foliage out, and this thing's a beautiful sculptural work. It's got all these branches